What would you do if saving the person you loved meant betraying your own father? Not just any father, the King of Israel, the most powerful man in the nation, a man whose commands could not be ignored, a man whose anger could be deadly. And what if that single decision changed the course of your life forever? Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. This story has fascinated people around the world for thousands of years. So take a moment and leave your country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these biblical stories reach. Most people know the story of David and Goliath. They know about the shepherd who defeated a giant, the warrior who became a king, the man whose name would be remembered for generations. But far fewer know the story of the woman who helped save his life. A woman whose courage altered the future of Israel. A woman whose name is often overlooked. Her name was Michal, the daughter of King Saul. And what happened to her would become one of the most tragic stories in the entire Bible. Michal seemed to have everything. She was born into royalty. She lived in a palace. She enjoyed wealth, privilege, and status. Her future appeared secure. But beneath the surface, events were already unfolding that would change her life forever. Because one night, Michal was forced to make an impossible choice. A choice between family and love. A choice between loyalty and conscience. A choice that would place her directly against her own father. That decision would save David's life. But it would also set in motion a chain of events that would follow her for years to come. A chain of events marked by separation, loss, and heartbreak. So why did Michal risk everything for David? Why did King Saul become obsessed with destroying the very man he had once welcomed into his court? And how did the princess who loved David become one of the saddest figures in biblical history? The answers lie within a story of jealousy, ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. A story where every decision carried a cost, and where the people closest to power often paid the highest price. But before Michal found herself caught between her father and her husband, before she was forced to choose a side, there was a young shepherd whose life changed in a single day. A shepherd who walked onto a battlefield as an unknown boy and left it as a national hero. His name was David. After defeating Goliath, his fame spread throughout Israel. The people celebrated him. The soldiers admired him. Songs were sung about his victories. Everywhere he went, his reputation grew. But while the nation rejoiced, something very different was happening inside the royal palace. Behind the celebrations, behind the smiles, behind the public praise, a darkness was beginning to take root in the heart of King Saul. A darkness that would eventually threaten David's life, and place Michal at the center of a conflict that would change Israel forever. David's victory over Goliath changed everything. In a single moment, the young shepherd from Bethlehem became the hero of Israel. The giant who had terrified an entire army was dead, and the Philistines fled in defeat. The people celebrated. The soldiers rejoiced, and King Saul welcomed David into his service. At first, there was no sign of conflict between them. David played music in Saul's court. He served faithfully and obeyed every command the king gave him. Whenever Saul sent him into battle, David returned victorious. Again and again, he proved himself. His courage earned the respect of the army. His wisdom earned the trust of the people. And with every victory, his reputation continued to grow. Soon, David was no longer known only as the shepherd who defeated Goliath. He became one of Israel's most successful military leaders. But success can attract more than admiration. Sometimes it attracts envy. One day, after another victory over Israel's enemies, the army returned home in celebration. Crowds gathered along the roads, welcoming the soldiers with songs and dancing. Among the celebrations, the women of Israel began to sing a song that would change everything. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. To the people, it was simply praise. To Saul, it sounded like a comparison. The song spread through the nation. Everywhere he went, Saul heard the same words. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The king's heart began to change. The young man he had once welcomed into his court no longer seemed like a loyal servant. Instead, Saul began to see him as a rival, a threat, someone who was becoming more popular than the king himself. Jealousy took root, and once it entered Saul's heart, it continued to grow. Every victory David won increased Saul's fear. Every cheer from the people deepened his suspicion. The king began watching David closely, searching for reasons not to trust him. Yet David remained loyal. He continued serving Israel. He continued fighting the kingdom's enemies. And he gave Saul no reason to doubt him. But jealousy does not need evidence. It only needs fear. Before long, Saul's suspicion turned into something much darker. He began looking for ways to remove David from his path. At first, the plans were subtle, hidden, carefully disguised. But the king's desire to be rid of David was becoming impossible to control. What Saul did not realize was that while he was plotting against David, something unexpected was happening inside his own household. Someone very close to him had been watching the young warrior. Someone who admired his courage and character. Someone whose feelings would complicate everything. Because Saul soon discovered something he never expected. His own daughter had fallen in love with David. As Saul's jealousy toward David continued to grow, an unexpected development took place within the royal family. The Bible tells us something remarkable. It says that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. That detail may seem small, but it is significant. In a time when marriages were often arranged for political reasons, Scripture specifically points out her love for him. Michal was a princess, the daughter of Israel's first king. She had grown up in the royal palace and witnessed David's rise firsthand. She had seen his courage, his success in battle, and the favor he enjoyed among the people. And somewhere along the way, she fell in love with him. When Saul learned of this, he saw an opportunity. On the surface, it appeared to be a generous offer. Allowing David to marry into the royal family would seem like a great honor. But Saul's motives were far from noble. The king was still searching for a way to eliminate David without turning the people against him. So he devised a plan. Instead of openly attacking David, Saul would place him in a situation so dangerous that he hoped the Philistines would do the job for him. Saul offered Michal to David in marriage, but there was a condition. David would have to prove himself worthy by completing a dangerous task against Israel's enemies. To Saul, it was the perfect trap. If David failed, he would die. If the Philistines killed him, Saul's hands would remain clean. The people would never know the king had been behind it. Confident that David would not survive, Saul waited. But David was not intimidated by the challenge. He accepted it. The same young man who had once faced Goliath now faced another impossible mission. And once again, he succeeded. Instead of being defeated, David accomplished far more than Saul had demanded. The plan that was meant to destroy him only increased his reputation. The king's trap had failed, and David's victory made him even more popular throughout Israel. For Michal, it meant she could finally marry the man she loved. But for Saul, it created a new problem. David was now not only a national hero, he was also a member of the royal family. The very man Saul feared was becoming more deeply connected to the throne. And with every passing day, the king's jealousy grew stronger. The marriage that should have brought peace only intensified the tension. Because Saul's hatred was no longer fading. It was becoming an obsession. And before long, that obsession would place David's life in greater danger than ever before. Instead of dying, David returned with a victory that shocked everyone. David's marriage to Michal did not solve Saul's problem. If anything, it made the king even more fearful. David's victories continued. The people admired him. The army respected him. And Saul became convinced that the young warrior was destined to take everything from him. His popularity, his throne, his legacy. The jealousy that had once been hidden in Saul's heart was now impossible to control. This was no longer suspicion. This was hatred. And before long, Saul made a decision. David had to die. The king began openly seeking his life. What had once been secret plots became direct attempts to eliminate him. The danger was no longer distant. It was immediate. Then one night, everything came to a head. Saul sent messengers to David's house. Their orders were simple. Surround the house. Watch every exit. And when morning came, kill him. David's enemies were no longer waiting for the right opportunity. They believed they had already found it. The trap was set. The soldiers took their positions. And from their perspective, there was no escape. But inside the house, word of the plot reached Michal, the daughter of Saul, the wife of David, the woman now caught between two loyalties, one to her father, the other to her husband. And she knew she could not remain neutral. If David stayed until morning, he would die. There was no time for debate, no time for hesitation, only a choice. Michal went to David and warned him. The danger was real. The soldiers were already outside. Every passing moment brought them closer to disaster. David listened, and together they acted quickly. Under the cover of darkness, Michal led David to a window. Below him lay uncertainty, but remaining inside meant certain death. So David climbed down and disappeared into the night. The future king of Israel slipped away while Saul's men waited outside, unaware that their target was already escaping. But Michal knew the soldiers would eventually come inside. When they did, they would expect to find David. And if the house was empty, the deception would be exposed immediately. So she came up with a desperate plan. Inside the bedroom, she arranged an idol in the bed. She covered it with blankets. Then she placed goat's hair near the head to make it appear as though a man was lying there. From a distance, in dim light, it looked convincing. Soon the messengers arrived. When they asked for David, Michal told them he was sick. The figure beneath the blankets seemed to support her story. For a moment, the deception worked. The soldiers returned to Saul with the report. But Saul was not satisfied. His anger had reached a point where excuses no longer mattered. "Bring him to me in his bed," the king ordered. If David was sick, they would carry him. If he was weak, they would drag him. Either way, Saul wanted him. The messengers returned. This time they approached the bed. This time they looked closer. And suddenly the truth became clear. The figure under the blankets was not David. It was an idol. The king had been deceived. The soldiers had been deceived. And the man they were sent to capture was already gone. By the time Saul learned what had happened, there was nothing he could do. David had escaped into the darkness. The trap had failed. And everyone knew who had made it possible. Michal had chosen David. She had protected the man her father wanted dead. And with that single decision, her relationship with Saul would never be the same again. By sunrise, David was gone. And Michal had officially betrayed the king. Helping David escape came at a cost. David was safe, but Michal remained behind to face the consequences of her decision. Saul never forgot what happened that night. He never forgot that his own daughter had chosen David over him. For the king, it was more than a personal betrayal. It was a challenge to his authority. And eventually, Saul acted. Unable to capture David, he turned his attention to Michal. The marriage between David and Michal was broken apart. Saul took his daughter and gave her to another man named Palti. Just like that, the life Michal had once imagined disappeared. The woman who had risked everything to save David was no longer his wife. Meanwhile, David remained a fugitive, moving from place to place as Saul continued his pursuit. Years passed. The conflict between Saul and David continued. Battles were fought. Alliances shifted. And slowly, the shepherd from Bethlehem moved closer to the destiny God had prepared for him. Then everything changed. Saul's reign came to an end, and David finally became king. The man who had once escaped through a window in the middle of the night now sat upon the throne of Israel. But as David strengthened his kingdom, he remembered something from his past. Michal, the woman who had once saved his life. And so David made a request. He demanded that Michal be returned to him. The request was granted. But what followed is one of the most emotional moments in the story. By this point, years had passed. Lives had moved on. Michal had built a new life. And when the time came for her to leave, her second husband could not hide his grief. The Bible tells us that he followed her weeping. Step after step, he walked behind her, crying as she was taken away. It is a brief detail, but a powerful one. It reminds us that the decisions of kings often affected ordinary lives. Eventually, he was ordered to return home. And with that, Michal's second marriage came to an end. She returned to David. At first glance, it may seem like a reunion. The woman who loved David had been restored to him. But years of separation had changed everything. The young princess who had fallen in love with a rising hero was gone. And the young warrior she had saved was gone as well. David was now a king. Michal carried the scars of years filled with loss, uncertainty, and disappointment. The relationship they once shared could not simply return to what it had been. Too much had happened. Too much time had passed. What should have been a joyful reunion carried a sense of distance instead. The wounds of the past had never truly healed. And the hardest chapter of Michal's life was still waiting to unfold. Because the greatest tragedy of her story was still ahead. Years after Michal had saved David's life, they found themselves together again. But the relationship was no longer what it had once been. Too much had happened. Too many years had passed. The young princess who had fallen in love with a shepherd was gone. And the young warrior she had helped escape was now the king of Israel. Then came one of the most important moments of David's reign. The Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence among his people, was finally being brought to Jerusalem. For David, this was more than a political event. It was a moment of worship. A moment of gratitude. A moment to honor the God who had guided him through years of danger, exile, and victory. The city erupted in celebration. People gathered from every direction to witness the occasion. Music filled the air. Voices rose in praise. And at the center of it all was David, not seated on a throne, not dressed in royal splendor, but rejoicing before the Lord with all his might. He danced. He celebrated. He humbled himself before God. For David, the approval of God mattered more than the approval of people. But not everyone shared that view. Watching from a window was Michal, the daughter of Saul, the woman who had once risked everything to save him. As she looked down at the celebration, she saw something very different. Where David saw worship, she saw humiliation. Where David saw joy, she saw a king lowering himself before the crowd. The Bible says that she despised him in her heart. When David returned home, Michal confronted him. Her words were sharp. She criticized him for the way he had behaved before the people. To her, a king should have carried himself with dignity and royal honor. She believed David had acted beneath the position he held. But David did not apologize. Instead, he answered firmly. He reminded her that it was God who had chosen him and established him as king. And if celebrating before the Lord required humility, he was willing to humble himself even more. It was a brief conversation, yet it revealed a deeper problem. This was not simply an argument about a public celebration. It was the collision of years of pain, disappointment, and unresolved wounds. Perhaps Michal still carried the scars of being taken from David, then given to another man, then taken back again. Perhaps the marriage had become more political than personal. Perhaps the love they once shared had been buried beneath years of hardship. Or perhaps pride had built a wall between them that neither could cross. Whatever the reason, the distance between them was now impossible to ignore. The couple that had once been united against Saul now seemed divided from each other. And sadly, this confrontation would become the defining moment of their final chapter together. Michal's story is unlike any other in Scripture. She was a princess who chose love over loyalty to the throne. A daughter who stood against her own father. A woman who risked everything to save the man she loved. When David's life was in danger, she acted with courage. When others remained silent, she made a choice that changed history. Without Michal's actions on that night, David's journey to the throne might have ended before it truly began. Yet despite all she gave, her own story did not end in triumph. She experienced separation, loss, disappointment, and heartbreak. The woman who helped save Israel's future king became one of the most tragic figures in the biblical narrative. Her story reminds us that courage often comes with a cost, that the choices we make in moments of conviction can shape the rest of our lives, and that even those who play important roles in God's larger story may face struggles of their own. Michal loved deeply. She sacrificed greatly. She saved David's life. But despite all she gave, her life ended in sorrow. And perhaps that is why her story remains so powerful today. Because it reminds us that faith, loyalty, love, and sacrifice are rarely simple. They often require difficult choices whose consequences can last for years. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of the Bible, subscribe and join us as we explore the people, mysteries, and events that shaped biblical history. And let us know in the comments. Do you believe Michal's story was a tragedy of circumstance or the result of choices made along the way? Until next time, thank you for watching.